The Eighth Amendment is the last of the more complicated amendments found in the Bill of Rights. And the Eighth Amendment deals with a few different things. It says excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. So let's talk about bail first of all. It says that bail cannot be excessive. Well, the word excessive means, I guess, more than needed, more than required. And that's all it talks about, in reference to bail. But we need to know what bail is. Bail is money that an arrested person pays as a right to leave jail. Now, not after they've been convicted of a crime, mind you, but if you've been arrested for a crime, and let's say you've been accused of this crime, you've been arrested, but you haven't been tried yet. That's part of your due process. Well, we are innocent until proven guilty. So it seems wrong to keep you in jail if you're innocent until you're proven guilty. But the fear is, what if a person gets out of jail, we let them out, and then they don't return for trial or any of the court dates? Then what? Well, bail is a way of better ensuring that someone returns. Bail is money that someone pays that allows them to leave jail. And as long as they show up for all their court dates and trials, then they will eventually get that money back. If they're convicted in a trial, then there's no money that will get them out of prison. But remember, bail is paid before a person is convicted of a crime. And then as long as you get it back, as long as you show up, you get it back. So bail cannot be excessive, which means more than needed to get someone to return. It's a little vague because, somebody who has strong ties to a community, it might not take much to get them to return. Somebody who was just passing through the community when arrested for a crime, maybe they're from another state, their bail might be set higher. There's different things to consider with bail when handed out, but the Eighth Amendment protects it from being just way more than required to get somebody to return. Eighth Amendment also says that cruel and unusual punishment should not be inflicted. Well, what do we mean by cruel and unusual punishment? I think, again, some of these terms, we know what they mean. We know what a cruel punishment is, but how do we put a definition on it? The courts have given us a statement. The court said, if a punishment shocks the conscience of the civilized world, then it is a cruel and unusual punishment. Shocks the conscience. I remember once, if you got time for a story, when I was in elementary school, I had a teacher that was just mean to the student. The student got a question wrong, and he probably shouldn't have gotten it wrong. Maybe she had the answer right up on the board. But anyway, she asked him, what's the answer? And he didn't know. And she asked him again and again and again. And obviously he still didn't know. And then she told the class to laugh at it. Now, I was only in, I think, second grade at the time. Maybe it was third grade. Anyway, I hadn't been in school long, for many years, but I knew this wasn't right. This just felt wrong. That's an example of something shocking my conscience. When it comes to punishment, if it shocks the conscience of the civilized world, if it shocks the conscience of society, the people in America, I guess that's cruel and unusual punishment. So whipping somebody, public flogging, that just feels wrong to most Americans. I guess that shocks our conscience. So any form of punishment that shocks the collective conscience of the United States, of the people of the United States, I guess would be considered cruel and unusual punishment. That may change over time. Something that may have been acceptable in the past may now shock our conscience. Maybe 200 years ago, a public flogging would have been acceptable. It would have been accepted as something that was a just punishment. Today, I think most of us would feel uncomfortable with that kind of punishment. So today, that shocks our conscience. The death penalty in the United States has been argued a bunch, and that all falls under the Eighth Amendment. The Supreme Court has not ruled that the death penalty itself is cruel and unusual punishment. Obviously, we still have it in the United States. So, when it comes to the death penalty, there's been a ton of ruling there. And I guess we got to start with, how do we determine if a method of execution is cruel and unusual punishment? Well, the Supreme Court said if the form of execution does more than merely extinguish the life, then that is cruel and unusual punishment. meaning that if it causes pain and suffering, that's more than just merely extinguishing the life. The punishment of execution is acceptable as long as it is not death plus pain. So beating someone to death would be cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment standard for execution. Really, the only form of execution that we use today is lethal injection. And lethal injection is a couple drugs that are injected into a person. The hope is it's much like going under anesthesia, that you don't feel anything, and then you silently pass away. If it leads to pain and then suffering, then it's a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Now, the Supreme Court has made a number of other rulings dealing with the Eighth Amendment. Some of the bigger ones, Furman versus Georgia in 1972. This is probably one of the biggest ones because it put it in the modern era. The Supreme Court ruled in 72 that the death penalty was in itself okay, but the way it was being handed out was not. And they basically called for a complete overhaul of the death penalty in the United States. And they said, until we get this overhaul, that no more executions are allowed. And some states decided they didn't want the death penalty then, but other states overhauled their system, and we have what is our modern death penalty, where you can only be executed for first-degree murder. I think the importance of Furman versus Georgia is the Supreme Court affirmed that the death penalty itself was not a violation of the Eighth Amendment, but it did say that some changes needed to be made to the death penalty the way we were carrying it out. In 1976, in Coker versus Georgia, the Supreme Court said that the death penalty can only be used for murder. It had previously been used for rape and murder. A rapist could be executed, but after this, the Supreme Court said that no, that would not be justified under the Eighth Amendment. Ford versus Wainwright in 86 said that we cannot execute somebody who is mentally insane. That would be cruel to execute somebody who doesn't really know why they're being executed. In 2002, in Atkins versus Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled that you can't execute somebody who's then designated to be mentally retarded. Now, we don't use that term anymore. We use intellectually and developmentally disabled. But if you read the case, because it was written in 2002, they would use the term mentally retarded. They said it was unconstitutional to execute somebody with this condition. And then Roper versus Simmons can't execute a person who was a juvenile when they committed the crime. If you committed a crime at age 17, even if you weren't convicted until age 18, it doesn't matter. It's how old you were when you committed the crime. And if you were under the age of 18, it's unconstitutional to execute you. Now, you could be in prison for the rest of your life, but you would not be executed. These are some of the major Supreme Court rulings dealing with the death penalty, but there has been a host of others. And it becomes somewhat of a controversial issue. Not all states use the death penalty, and we use it less than we used to. Let me show you, excuse me, a few things here. This shows executions throughout history in the United States. And you notice the red here is hanging, or kind of the maroon is hanging, which was the method of execution for most of the United States history up to the 1900s. And then electrocution started to be the method of execution. And then, now you look in the more recent, now right here, notice there's nothing going on. This is that time when the Supreme Court ruled that, we needed to overhaul the death penalty. And then when we started to use it again, there was still some electrocution. But for the most part, it's been lethal injection. And if you notice this, we don't execute a lot of people. The most we've executed is close to 100 since 1976. And this gives our total of executions in the United States and the number, of what method was used. Electrocutions, hanging, and now lethal injections have been the main ones. This shows a chart. This is from the Death Penalty Information Center. It was updated November 2014. And this shows since 1976, when the Supreme Court was in the more modern era, that the most executions we've ever had is 98. And in 2014, up until, and we're in almost December, we're mid-November right now, 31 executions this year, 39 executions last year, 43 the 2 years previously. There's something like 12 to 13,000 murders a year. So obviously most people are not being executed. There are 32 states that use the death penalty. South Dakota is one of them. There are 18 states that do not, including, Alaska, Connecticut, Hawaii, and so on. Our neighbors, North Dakota and Minnesota and Iowa, none of those use the death penalty. So the death penalty is a state issue. It is controversial, and it is not used much. South Dakota has not used it a lot, but we are using it. We have used it more in the last few years than we had in the past. This shows the number of inmates on death row. California has 745 people on death row, but they rarely execute anybody. I don't think they've executed anybody in about 5 years. Florida, Texas, Alabama, and so on. The states that execute the most, it may be hard to see this on your computer screen, but Texas has executed 16 in 2013, 10 this year, a total of 518 since 1976. Not even close to any other state. South Dakota has executed 3. This is a pretty interesting site. It has a lot of stats and data there if you're interested. The Death Penalty Information Center. The Eighth Amendment protects us from being punished in a way that would be deemed cruel and unusual punishment. It's not just the death penalty it deals with, but that's what comes up the most. The other aspect is if it's a non-death penalty case, prisons must have a minimum standard of care. You can't send somebody to prison and say, well, you just fend for yourself. We're going to give you, bread and water and no care within prison. That doesn't fall within the standard care that we would provide for somebody. So punishments can't be cruel and unusual. That means that they can't shock our conscience. If we execute somebody, it is not for whatever crime we want. We are very limited on that. Capital punishment is limited by what the Supreme Court has ruled and their interpretation of the Eighth Amendment. And for non-death penalty cases, again, a minimum standard of care is required. So we don't have any option, any and every option available to us when it comes to punishment of criminals.